Hello, I'm Eugene Mulero, and welcome to today's LiveOnWeb Infrastructure Week Reporter Roundtable. We're coming to you from the greater Washington, D.C. area, where advocates have spent the past 5 days focusing on the state of the nation's infrastructure and lobbying policymakers on Capitol Hill to invest in the roads, bridges, rail systems, and ports that are critical to moving the nation's freight. Joining me to talk about it today are 3 Capitol Hill journalists who follow these issues for their news organizations. They are Jacob Fischler, Transportation Policy Reporter for CQ Roll Call, Kathryn Wolfe, Deputy Transportation Editor for Politico Pro, and Melanie Zanona, staff writer for the Hill newspaper. We invite you to participate in today's program. You can email your question or comments to share@ttnews.com. If you're watching on ttnews.com, you can comment directly in the box at the top of the live blog container. And if you're watching via Facebook Live, simply enter your question in the comment box. I want to thank our panelists for joining us today. And let me start with what we had this week with Secretary Chow at the Chamber. She led off the Infrastructure Week kickoff, and she really didn't lay out a plan, but later in the week, Melanie, you wrote about a development from the White House about what this $1 trillion infrastructure plan could look like.
That's right. Well, it was certainly a busy infrastructure week. Not all of it was transportation related, of course, but there were a couple of significant developments that I think really came out that all of us reporters were really tracking. The latest one was that Sean Spicer, the press secretary for the White House, came out and tweeted that the budget proposal from the White House that is expected to be released on Tuesday is going to contain some funding for infrastructure, and that is supposed to be, quote, the first step towards this $1 trillion infrastructure push. So what we know so far is it's going to have $200 billion. Unclear how that's going to be paid for, but there will be an emphasis on private investment, private sector money, which, as you know, is part of Trump's infrastructure plan and one of the top priorities for the administration.
And we didn't have to wait a few weeks. We got this first steps from Spicer. And this $200 billion, that's something Secretary Chow kept saying will be something to help leverage funding for a transportation bill. Also, during her keynote address, she not only said that it will be for infrastructure projects, but it will include broadband and veterans hospitals. Kathy, what was your takeaway from her keynote speech?
Well, I think, the primary thing that I noticed was when she said to expect, because the timeline for this infrastructure plan has sort of gone back and forth, at least in terms of the way that she has talked about it. She's talked about May, she's talked about fall, and I think in her speech she outlined in the clearest way what exactly she meant. There's actually both in some ways. Yeah. That there's going to be some kind of, I believe she called it a statement of principles coming out this month. And then with the expectation that Congress would follow suit with some kind of legislative package, and I believe she said the third quarter. So, and to me, I think, this budget coming out is really the first chance for the administration to show us exactly what they want to do. And whether they'll do that or not, I'm not sure. Did she mean May? Did she mean the budget is going to be the statement of principles that's expected in May, or will there be something separate following after? Unknown, but that I would say that's certainly what I'm watching for, like what exactly is going to be in the budget and how much detail it's going to have.
And you're referring to the fiscal 2018 budget proposal coming out of OMB next week.
Yes.
Any insight from your colleagues or yourself at CQ as to what what to expect either in transportation or from the budget proposal?
Well, in the transportation world, I don't know really what to expect beyond what we've been shown in the skinny budget, as it's called.
I know, yeah.
That zeroed out a couple of popular programs, the Essential Air Service in aviation, and Tiger grants, which are discretionary grants from the Secretary of Transportation's office. Chow said something interesting this week at the EPW committee in the Senate that perhaps is back on the table and could be, the administration might kind of walk back from that. Other than that, I think $200 billion is a number that's out there. We don't know. I I think it's unclear if that's going to be really direct spending by the federal government, or if that number will also include some tax credits, which are scored the same way by OMB.
I do want to get to what happened on Capitol Hill this week, but let's talk a little bit about Infrastructure Week, events you guys went to. I was listening to the Chamber of Commerce President Tom Donahue. He again sounded the alarm about the need for more money for projects and to bring the private investors in there, and also to raise the gas tax. He really called on that. What were some of the events or panels that you guys really enjoyed, either had some strong takeaways, wrote about, or really found useful and part of your daily reporting?
I would say probably the newsiest thing I wrote this week came out of one of the hearings with Secretary Chao, where she told senators that there would not be a list of projects included in the infrastructure bill, which I think a lot of people were either hoping or suspected that there will be some sort of indication of exactly which projects they want to get included for, especially with direct funding. So I think that was really interesting to hear from her, especially in the same breath saying essentially that she was, the administration is supporting the Gateway program in the Northeast Corridor. So I think that signals to me that there is going to be some mechanism to get money to projects that aren't capable of tapping private sector dollars. There could be more creative ways to ensure that money flows to them, but perhaps it won't be singled out in the infrastructure package.
That's a good point. Kathy, what about you? We had, ENO was involved in Infrastructure Week. You had IBTTA, APTA, ASHTO, everybody was there, ARPA. What was one takeaway from the week?
Well, I think the takeaway is usually what it always is, which is that people want more investment. But how do we pay for it is always a problem. But I actually would like to go back to something that Melanie said about the project list. And I agree that that was definitely one of the newsmakers this week was what Chao said about this project. And one of my questions from the start, if you listen to the way they have talked about this infrastructure plan, they've talked about setting up some kind of commission to recommend projects. Unclear what that would be, unclear how it would fit in with this infrastructure package that they're planning. But I think, to me, the way that I've been listening to it and trying to figure out how it would work is you're talking about possibly something like an infrastructure bank. I don't know what exactly kind of mechanism they're talking about, but that would suggest that actually I think dovetails with what the Secretary said today about this, whatever this infrastructure plan is, not having a project list. Maybe it'll be outside of the bill. Maybe it'll be like I said, like an infrastructure bank or something like that. I thought that was really interesting. I think the other thing that kind of that we reported on that kind of flew under the radar a little bit is if you look at her prepared testimony, she had a quote in there about wanting this, that the administration desires a long-term fix for our transportation system, which to me implicates the problems with the Highway Trust Fund. I don't know what that means. She gave no details, but it suggests it's at least on their mind, and I think that would be welcome for a lot of people who spoke during Infrastructure Week.
And this was Wednesday when she was before the Senate EPW committee.
That's right.
And she fielded questions from, the chairman, the ranking member, Tom Carper, talking about the need for investments. And I want to ask you, Jacob, the one thing that the secretary, aside from the list, she also said that everything was on the table. What was your takeaway when you heard that?
Yeah, I think the administration is not sure yet how they're going to get the money to pay for this big initiative they want to do. And saying that everything is on the table, I think just implies that they haven't set a course from A to B. How are they going to raise the money? How are they going to spend it? What projects they're going to do? I thought it was interesting that you didn't have people objecting as strongly to raising the gas tax. If you bring that up, people say, oh, well, everything's on the table. They don't immediately dismiss it, even on the Republican side. So that was an indication to me that could be something they're thinking about. And Senator Jim Inhofe, who's a past chairman of EPW, said that that's something they're probably going to take a look at.
What did you guys think about that? That there was not a rejection of raising the fuel tax? Were they just for lack of a better term, kind of just bluffing a little, or are they serious that they're really, this is in fact on the table? Because it's been the radioactive.
Right.
Paul Ryan had that famous hearing like 2 years ago, and he said absolutely not right out of the gate. So should we take them, lack of a better term, seriously, or are they just throwing it out there, but ultimately they're just going to do like a gimmick thing?
I think they are playing it safe when they say everything's on the table. I mean, on the one hand, we saw what happened when Trump even opened the door just a little bit by saying he was considering the idea, and it sent shockwaves through the Capitol. Sean Spicer had to immediately walk it back. So I don't think anyone, especially someone like Schuster or Chow, is going to come out and say, yeah, we're considering this. This is, something we want to use. But by not taking it off the table, they also protect themselves from saying, they're not willing to do whatever it takes to get this big infrastructure package. You can't say, I would do anything for love, but I won't do that. They can't say that they're going to not do the gas tax. But I think the political reality is that there's no way that this gets done in this Congress, a Republican-led Congress.
You're talking raising the gas tax.
Yeah, with Speaker Ryan, who was, as Ways and Means chairman, one of the strongest voices against this. I don't see him allowing that to come to the House floor.
And what about you, Kathy? Are they going to approve the gas tax, or no way?
One thing that I have learned over the past couple of cycles is that I am apparently no longer good at predicting things, so I'm not going to say anything definitive, but I will say this. Something that I've noticed, I actually agree with a lot of what you said. One thing that I've noticed is that nobody is talking specifics about, sure, everything's on the table, but the last time the gas tax got raised, it got raised as part of a broader budget deal.
93.
And that's right. And so now we also have another moment where there could potentially be a very wide-ranging tax code overhaul that would provide potentially a moment where they could do something similar. So I'm not saying they will or they won't, but as I'm watching this, what I'm looking for are specific discussions around this. When I start seeing, or continue to not see, something like a gas tax raised in conjunction with discussions of a tax code overhaul, then I'll think, okay, that would trip my ear. When people start getting specific about what's going to be in here, and start lobbying for it or don't. I think right now things are so unclear and nebulous that it's too early. But that's what I would be watching for, because I think that's a place where if it's going to happen, it would happen. But I almost feel like discussions about a gas tax hike are already done. Like,
We've been there, done that?
Well, no, I think it's already, the moment has passed, really. Like,
okay.
Cars are going to continue to get more fuel efficient. I think actually the drop in vehicle miles traveled has reversed itself. But for a while there, people were actually also driving less, and I don't think that gets any better. And so I think that we're already past the moment where we start we're realistic talking about a gas tax increase, and on to the moment where people are already starting to look ahead 10 years and look towards something like VMT. Vehicle miles traveled. Emulate
the model in Oregon, California, see which one's better.
Well, I think that's just the reality. The gas tax is a failing model for a reason, and you can prop it up again and go through all that fight, or you can invest your political capital in something that's not going to be obsolete again in 10 years.
Right. What do you make of your colleague Tanya Snyder? She asked the chairman of EPW, John Barrazo of Wyoming, what he meant when he said the committee was working on something on their own, and then he clarified that EPW is in fact working on a bill. What was your takeaway when you heard the chairman say that the Senate is working on something, and now, while they wait for the White House to give them something?
Well, I think I would expect that they would be.
Okay.
I mean, and I think even the best case scenario as envisioned by the administration doesn't seem to involve them putting forward a fully fleshed out legislative package. That everything that I've heard coming from the administration, to the extent that they've said anything, is that they're planning on putting out some principles and then expecting Congress to sort of take the ball and run with it. So I would expect Congress to already be working on their own principles. I mean, certainly the administration would inform what they do, but I don't think anyone in Congress is going to just sort of abdicate that and be like, sure, we'll just do this.
Well, I asked that because the dynamics now, you had Chairman Bill Schuster on the House side saying that he is in fact going to wait for the guidance from the White House, and then in the fall, work on a bill and have a markup.
Well, I think it's kind of interesting the different approaches that you're seeing with Barrasso on the Senate side and Schuster on the House. With Schuster, I mean, I think they're probably both working behind the scenes to kind of get stuff ready, but Schuster's in public is very much, every time you ask him, we're waiting for the administration, we want to work with the administration, we don't want to get ahead of the administration, and Barrasso's been not, has said some of the same things, but has been less shy about holding hearings about the needs for rural America, for example, and kind of being upfront about what he wants to see in a bill and kind of sending those public signals versus working behind the scenes.
The other thing Chow mentioned this week was the fast lane grants that they're going to be coming out. What are you guys hearing? You're hearing the same thing, sometime soon this month, and addressing freight projects nationwide?
Yeah, I don't really have any additional details. I think it seems like they're fairly imminent, and I think they've been working on them for some time.
The one thing, during the week, I bumped into Marcia Hill of Building America's Future, and we talked about, her group's efforts to gather support from lawmakers and from other groups. And she also mentioned, that what we need right now is some leadership at the top, and I think we do have a clip of that video. I bumped into her at the Chamber of Commerce, and her group is led by former Secretary Ray LaHood, Transportation Secretary, and former Pennsylvania Governor Ed Rendell, who kicked off Infrastructure Week over at the Philadelphia airport. Yeah. While we wait for the clip, do we have the clip ready? Okay.
The disagreements comes over how we're going to pay for it. But what is really needed is leadership at the top. So the Trump administration needs, when they come out with their formal plan, they really need to get behind it. And there are many groups around town, ours included, who, if it is something we can agree with, and we will try to help make it happen.
I bring up the Marcia Hill thing because she talked about leadership, and also I bring this up because I know that Secretary Chow has been on the job just for a few months. That's what she tells everybody, but she's really not making herself accessible. And I don't want to dwell on this too much, but I know that we've written about this, and if we can go around the table and. I know that we've put in requests, to interview her about freight concerns, the trucking industry, et cetera. But also, just a quick background, speaking of LaHood, I remember LaHood, he would be so accessible, take so many questions that you actually run out of stuff to ask the guy.
And Secretary Fox used to have these quarterly pen and pads with reporters, which was incredible. And when I first started as a transportation reporter, I had come over from the healthcare side, and we didn't have any access there. So I don't know if it's that unusual, broadly speaking, but I know for us as transportation reporters, it was quite the contrast going from the last administration to the new administration. But what I will say is it has only been a few months. They don't even have all their staff. I think there is some reluctance to make the secretary accessible to the press because they don't have answers to the questions they know we're going to be asking. And like Kathy already said, the times Chow has spoken and given a deadline or a timeline or said some of these things, it's kind of went back and forth. So my sense would be that they're trying to avoid putting her in that spot of having to answer these questions where there just aren't answers yet.
I circle back to, I think you and I were talking to Senator Inhofe after a hearing on Tuesday, and he mentioned that the secretary had been vague during her confirmation hearing. Could you add to that? Do you feel that it's because she's still trying to staff up and,
Well, I certainly, I don't know what what she's thinking, what her strategy is, but it could be, I moderated another panel this week, and somebody brought up the point that there isn't really a point person in the White House yet in terms of this infrastructure initiative. So whether it's some days it's Gary Cohn, some days it's DJ Gribbin. Where does Chao fit in? You know, presumably she's very active, but it might have to do with the administration kind of producing a cohesive message as well.
Kathy, you guys wrote a little bit about this.
We did, yeah. I mean, there's definitely, you know, she's had a handful of public events where she hasn't made herself available to the press afterward, and that's generated some frustration, not only at my publication, but I think at everyone here at the table. I would tend to agree with Melanie. I think that probably this is a new administration. They're still getting their legs under them. They've put out a really ambitious plan and still haven't, you know, details of which are nebulous, which is exactly what all of us are going to be asking about. And it would not surprise me if some of it was due to that. You don't want to set your boss up for not being able to answer questions. But that's pure speculation on my part. And I also would say, you know, I certainly appreciate the comparison to former Secretary LaHood, because he was quite accessible, but he was also a member of Congress for many, many years and had to deal with that dynamic, which probably prepared him for dealing with people like us considerably more than someone else might be. But yes, it's certainly been something of concern and an area of frustration for, I know, the press corps that covers DOT regularly.
You know, I don't mean to dwell on it too much, but Secretary Chao is also not a rookie. She was in the cabinet before, you know, so to me, for Infrastructure Week, for being on the Hill, I just thought that there was going to be an opportunity for her to at least address, you know, the press corps. And, you know, we work with, you know, politicians all the time. You know, the pros know how to field some questions, kind of do a quick non-answer stuff. So I was expecting her to at least, you know, do some acknowledgement. Because I just feel like this is a trend right now.
Well, she certainly is probably one of the most qualified and experienced cabinet secretaries that the president appointed. I'm not familiar with how she led the Labor Department. Maybe we should talk to other reporters and see what that was like, if they had more access or not. Maybe that's just how she runs things, and you know, maybe we should expect it to be similar for the DOT as well.
Moving on. Talk about, you know, the DOT. They just nominated Jeff Rosen as Deputy Secretary at DOT. What can we expect from him? Is this going to be an injection of policy, just adding to the brain trust over there?
Well, that typically is kind of the day-to-day nitty-gritty policy. It's a very important position in the DOT. I don't have that much to add about Mr. Rosen's record, but I thought it was interesting that there was a lot of Democratic opposition in the Senate to his vote. I think he only had 54 something yes votes.
Yeah.
I don't know really what to make of that, but it is definitely something to keep an eye on.
Was that really a test vote, just the Democrats really telling the administration that, hey, we want money for transit, we want money for, you know, our infrastructure grants?
Oh, I definitely think that's part of it, and we heard some lawmakers say that both during the committee process and then, you know, during the floor vote as well. They want to make sure that they want to hold the administration accountable. And there were concerns with Mr. Rosen and his record, as well as just more broadly speaking, that the administration did come out and propose some cuts for transportation. They said, hey, this isn't matching up. What can we really expect here from the DOT? But I do think the vote, it was interesting to see, you know, so many no votes for a DOT deputy secretary, which I think is a little unusual, but it could just be getting wrapped up in the broader atmosphere on Capitol Hill right now, for sure.
If you go back to Chao's confirmation vote, Minority Leader Schumer voted against her. She's married to his counterpart, the Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, and I just. And as Melanie said, she's eminently qualified for her position. I think it just kind of speaks to the atmosphere on Capitol Hill and in Washington generally right now.
Yeah, I really enjoyed Senator Cory Booker from my home state of New Jersey during the committee vote for Jeffrey Rosen. Give such a passionate speech saying that he's doing this for people at Amtrak, Newark Penn Station.
Yes.
Your take? Did you have some reaction?
I think they both basically laid it out. I think a lot of it was about the general atmosphere. I think a lot of it was about laying down a marker. I think some of it was probably concerns about him personally and the things that he's done and the positions that he's taken. But I will say that Jeff Rosen he's a respected attorney and policymaker here in Washington. He's a well-known quantity, and I think that you'll see that borne out.
What's the anticipation now that there's going to be a cascade of nominations for the sub-agencies and fill the DOT tree, to borrow from a Senate term? Is that what we should anticipate?
I would hope so. I mean, there was a lag between the last nomination, between the time President Trump announced the intent to when it was actually sent to the Senate. So hopefully we start to see more positions fill in and they get staffed up, and then they really get the ball rolling here.
Yeah. What I'm hearing out of the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration is that they're expecting to be the last kid on the bus to get, a nominee for a full-time, a permanent administrator. They're working with an acting administrator now, Daphne Jefferson, and the dynamics at DOT, FMCSA is always kind of like, after the Highway Administration, you get over to FMCSA. Let's go back to the hearing, because Secretary Chow talked about, the Tiger grants. And here she, from the skinny budget, they eliminated money for it. And now she wasn't as declarative as rejecting money for the Tiger grants. That was what I thought she said.
Yeah, I think she said two things. She first kind of tried to explain what was going on in the skinny budget. She was saying, we thought that this $500 million that annually goes into these discretionary funds, we could take that and put it into, I think she called it like a holistic initiative, or whatever term she used. So basically that would go towards the administration's infrastructure plan. Then she said, we heard you guys on Capitol Hill. It's a very popular program, and it's something that we are discussing, in the interim between the skinny budget and the full budget request, that the administration is discussing if they should kind of ask for funding again. And she kind of walked back that zeroing out that was in the skinny budget.
And she also did explain, look, this is the first budget of a new administration. They wanted to make their mark make a statement about spending in general. So I think we can expect that maybe the actual proposal that comes out, it's going to include $200 billion for infrastructure. Maybe the Tiger grants get put into a pot of money elsewhere. So I think she was in a tough spot a little bit here, trying to defend these agency cuts and reconcile that with the infrastructure proposal. But I think she did a good job explaining, like, we all know this is not going to become law either. This is just the first budget, and maybe next year we'll see something different.
Well, were you guys surprised by the pushback that the administration got from Congress, that all these people came out of the woodwork saying, hey, we love Tiger grants? Because there was a point where the Tiger grants, I know, former Senator from Louisiana, why is his name escaping me? David Vitter was leading the opposition on the Tiger grants, saying that they were political, that they were kind of gifts from the administration. I was somewhat surprised that everybody, it seemed, was clamoring for them.
Well, I think some of the opposition is that they were never authorized. They're appropriated every year. They were set up by Obama's economic stimulus package. But as the states started seeing the benefits, and these senators and congressmen in their districts started seeing how popular these programs were and what they were getting for them, they have a really wide range of eligibility. I think they're starting to see that, hey, maybe we want to hold on to these grants.
Anything about the Tiger stuff?
Yeah, I think, first of all, maybe I'm just extra cynical, but I don't disagree with either of the perspective in terms of what Chow said and kind of trying to walk it back a little bit, but I also have heard her in the past at least say, yes, we made these cuts, but we're going to make it up in our infrastructure plan. So I don't necessarily know if she meant to expect it to not be cut in their full budget, or if she meant, look, we're just going to take care of this another way in another piece of legislation. So that's my caution. Number two, in terms of the popularity of the Tiger program, I guess I'm a sort of bottom line kind of person. I don't think that Congress is going to go along with those cuts, no matter what the budget document says.
Is it because the genie's out of the bottle?
I think people like the program. There have been other attempts to cut and I think even defund Tiger that have failed, and so I don't see why it would suddenly be gone. And I think, you know, they're perpetually oversubscribed. There's clearly a pent-up desire for this money, and that translates into political capital, right? Like if you have a transit system in your state or your district and they want a grant, and you're calling your member of Congress saying, I want some of this money, don't cut it, like that carries some weight. And you know, I think regardless of sort of what the budget has or doesn't have, I don't think that Congress is going to zero out Tiger grants.
Let me go quickly to a question that we received from one of our viewers, and he wrote, will there ever be a time when transportation tax dollars go only to transportation projects? Jacob, you write about budgets?
Yeah, a little bit. It's hard to say. I mean, ever is a long time, right? But I think that as long as you're able to, and if I'm not sure, you know, if this person would include transit and that kind of thing. Some people are very...
they just want it for the highways themselves.
Right,
yeah.
right. But then there's also things like bike paths and that are, you can kind of make a case for transportation, but people will also say this is really not a federal role. I think that as long as you're always going to have ways that you can kind of twist money around and make it go into kind of go off to the side a little bit. That's my opinion.
Just going back to Transport Infrastructure Week, because you brought up bike paths, the second panel, the panel right after Secretary Chow, there was the CEO of the National Association of Manufacturers. Then there was a gentleman next to him. I'll look it up. I'll email it to our viewers. But he flat out said during his panel, he said, by the way, I hate bike paths.
That's right.
Yeah.
And I was like, what?
Yeah.
But someone else said, or maybe this was the same person, that, but I support them because one person on a bike is just one less car that I have to worry about on the highway.
Right.
Yeah.
Which I thought was interesting.
I know. And then during Infrastructure Week, the American Transportation Research Institute came out with a report saying that in 2015, congestion along the country's highways cost the trucking industry $63.4 billion. Melanie, you spoke with the mayor of Los Angeles, who was on the Capitol Hill on Tuesday before the Senate. He talked about, bumper-to-bumper traffic in LA.
Yeah, it's a huge problem in LA. And the mayor is now leading a task force on infrastructure to specifically work with both the administration and with the Congress to try to help shape this $1 trillion infrastructure package. But, he said, look, LA, a lot of cities are moving ahead without federal involvement, without this infrastructure bill, even if it doesn't help. There's ways that we can move forward on our own. I think some of the things that he at least wants to see is maintaining these grant programs or some sort of grant program, ways they can access federal dollars with the help of the federal government. But he seems pretty optimistic. I asked him on a scale of 1 to 10, how optimistic are you that an infrastructure bill gets done this Congress, not this year?
Wow.
He's at a 7, which was pretty high, I thought.
7 out of 10 being very
yes,
optimistic?
10 being the highest.
Okay.
So he's pretty optimistic. He's met with, at least this week, he sat down with Schumer and also Secretary Chow he sat down with, testified at a hearing, and he plans to come back and continue meeting with leaders. And spoke
at the kickoff event at Infrastructure Week. And had a really good anecdote about La La Land when he was before the Senate. That was a running theme of Infrastructure Week, was congestion. And the problems that congestion have not only on the freight industry, but also on motorists. Kathy, you've written extensively about how many hours we waste stuck in traffic. Was there any new insight this week on the problems of congestion that we advanced the ball in fixing the problem?
Not that I saw, but I was not specifically for Infrastructure Week, but I actually feel like this is something that didn't get a whole lot of coverage here in Washington, D.C., but when New Jersey Transit had all of its problems with the Amtrak derailment, and there were a couple of days when when, commuting via New Jersey Transit just was not, it was not possible, was not working. And you really saw like the effect of dumping all those commuters out onto the roads. I mean, it was taking like, an hour and a half to go 10 miles or something like that. Like people who normally do commute by car, were basically just, the roads got so locked up by these people who were displaced, who had to get, they had to get to where they needed to go, and so they had to take a car to do it when they normally take transit. So I think, back to the question about transportation tax money being only dedicated to core purposes, and I think there's definitely a school of thought out there that the gas tax money shouldn't go to transit, that it should only go to highways, and I think that demonstrates the conflict with that, because when you have people who normally commute via rail out on the street, it still affects you in your car.
What about Jacob, I turn to you. There's been 24 states, give or take, I think it's 24, recently they have raised the gas tax because they're saying they can't wait for the federal government to, do it themselves. Mm-hmm. Do you anticipate more states to continue in that trend? And maybe notwithstanding what your comments about the gas tax, being an outdated model, but do you think that the states are going to continue in that direction?
I see no reason not to. I mean, I think we're expecting, red states like South Carolina did this month, recently. Louisiana, I think you were telling me, was expected to in the near future. And like Kathy mentioned, there's like no, it's a heavy lift on Capitol Hill to do something with the federal government. There's kind of two thoughts out there related to states doing it. One is Democrats, Senator Tom Carper in particular, likes to say, look, all these states are doing it. Most of these state legislators don't lose their job, right? The voters understand what's going on. And then other folks might say, well, yeah, the states are raising their gas taxes, and if we do it at the federal level, that's going to be too much. That's going to be too much of a burden because the states have taken care of it. So, you can kind of read it either way.
And we're having this conversation, correct me if I'm wrong, because Grover Norquist in Americas for Tax Reform and the pledge that he has members sign.
That's right.
So because a lot of these guys on Capitol Hill signed up to this pledge, that's why they're not taking that tough vote?
Well, not all of them. Congressman Lou Barletta, he actually signed that pledge, but he also does support an increase of the gas tax. And when I asked him about it, he said, I don't think a pledge like that should stand in the way of something as important as coming up with a long-term funding solution. Now, I don't think every lawmaker is going to be as willing to ditch that pledge in favor of this, but there is starting to be a recognition, at least, that there needs to be some sort of solution for the Highway Trust Fund.
Barletta sits on the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee.
That's right.
I think that's a little simplistic also, because opposition to raising the gas tax is not only from Republicans. There are Democrats who are also not willing to go that far. And I even, during the last debate, Senator Boxer, who's of course now no longer in Congress,
from California, yeah.
Right, but at the time she also was not willing to go along with the gas tax increase. I think
Obama.
the most that she was willing to do was to index it to inflation.
Yeah.
There's also ways to. There's been bills that have tried to get around the no tax hike pledge by including other offsets in that, in order to get around that pledge, and saying, hey, well, we're raising this, but we're also making other offsets here. So there are ways around that pledge standing in the way. So it's not an excuse for just the Republicans.
Yeah, and famously, I remember going back, this is turning into nostalgic Ray LaHood time over here, but I remember the former Transportation Secretary famously saying he would support a gas tax, and then the White House quickly saying, hey, slow down, buddy.
Yeah, they yanked him back. That's right, yes. Yeah. And it's unfortunate that former Representative Jim Oberstar is no longer with us, but he talked quite candidly about how they were very close to raising the gas tax following the bridge collapse in his home state.
Yeah.
And then he claims that they were ready to vote it in, and then they went on recess, and then the moment passed, and that was it.
That's right. I do want to wrap up with, look ahead on Capitol Hill and revisit what the talks on Capitol Hill. But I'm going to summarize this one question that we got from one of our viewers, which is, when we look at the landscape, the transportation landscape in the coming years, maybe 5-10 years down the road, what influence will autonomous technology, what would that be the role of autonomous technology? Are we going to all have, smart cars, maybe flying cars? What do we think?
Well, there was a House Appropriations Subcommittee hearing on that topic this week. I think the kind of thought out there is that the kind of system is going to change a bit, where I might not own a driverless car, you might not own a driverless car.
Not yet.
No, but the system will be, manufacturers, whether that's GM, Ford, or like Google, tech companies, are going to own fleets and kind of offer it on a service as a service rather than a take-home product. I think there's a potential there to ease congestion, as we were talking about, with sensors and kind of sense and avoid technology. You can fit more cars at the same time, but also the House members were saying this week that doesn't fix everything. You can't build your way out of congestion is a common refrain, and the question was raised, well, if we have a system of autonomous vehicles, can we cut back on transit spending, which is expensive? And the answer from some of the witnesses was no. You need to invest in that as well to keep cars off the road, and roads can be just as congested with autonomous vehicles as they can with traditional.
Not only congestion, but also an argument that we hear from members of Congress is safety, that autonomous technology will boost safety, and we've heard that you've reported on that. Mm-hmm. Senator Susan Collins from Maine has talked about that.
That's right. I mean, I think that's one of the most appealing aspects to many of these lawmakers. The congestion is a great thing as well, but saving lives, and the DOT especially has launched a new initiative trying to get down to zero fatalities on the roads. And these vehicles, this technology holds that tremendous potential. Where you run into problems is when you still have a mix of the self-driving cars and the human drivers on the road. And until it's a fully autonomous system, you're still going to be having accidents. It's never going to be zero, as long as you still have people behind the wheel.
And Kathy, I know you prefaced us by saying that your powers of prediction are not what they used to be.
And yet I just made one not too long ago.
That's right. And here's another one. So in 10 years, we're all going to be driving Teslas, and we're all going to be in Elon Musk's vision and going to Hyperloop.
Who knows? But I find that hard to believe, only because I think that most likely adoption of these kinds of technologies will come in the commercial space, because that's where the money's being invested. I think you'll continue to see companies like Uber trying to push for, basically drivers are a pain for them, and so it's a business decision. So to the extent that it's driven by their business decisions, I think I could see some progress there. I think that the trucking industry is very interested in not having to deal with drivers and all of their hours of service issues and personnel issues, and so I think the idea of like driverless platooning is probably really attractive.
That's when there's a lead truck and then several trucks behind it.
Yes, and just the idea, and I will say, in terms of the safety, you're right. Safety is very, very much attractive reason for policymakers and also for the industry. And I think it's fairly widely accepted in the transportation space that when you increase automation, you decrease human error. That's certainly the case in the aviation space, and I don't see why it wouldn't be in the space of cars. Of course, you also make a good point that really the problems seem to come when you have a driverless car interacting with a human, and even just a simple example, if you're at a four-way stop and you're not quite sure whose turn it is to go next, but somebody goes like this, so they waves you in, and you're okay, now I'm going to go. That doesn't happen with, you can't wave a driverless car forward and say, no, you can go ahead. Like, this is a simple example of a pretty complex problem.
And it's just, and also when you read about it, when you talk to the players, it's so exciting. These guys, there's a race to be the leading autonomous vehicle company. There's a race for having the best technology. There was intrigue. A former Google, there's a lawsuit. Former Google guy went to Uber and apparently allegedly.
I hope someone writes a screenplay on this whole saga.
Yeah, right.
Maybe it should be us.
Yeah, I got it. That would be great. We have time for one more question before we start wrapping up. And I wanted to ask about regulations. And to just quick preface that's something the administration has been talking about. Basically, what's the landscape looking like for reforming environmental regulations and minimizing and streamlining, construction, the permitting process for construction companies?
Well, that's obviously a chief priority of this infrastructure package. I think it's interesting that the Secretary also decided to testify for the first time on Capitol Hill since her confirmation hearing in front of EPW, the Environment and Public Works Committee. I think that signals that the proposal that comes out of the White House is going to focus on streamlining a lot of these permit approvals. But you're going to hear pushback from especially Democrats who say, number one, the last two highway bills streamlined some of these, and even those aren't through yet. So why don't we wait on those before we start going streamlining, hacking more? And number two, I think there's going to be some concern from the environmental aspect about rolling that back and what effect it's going to have. But we have heard the administration say, DJ Gribbin said at an event, as well as Secretary Chao, that you can still be environmentally friendly while streamlining and making this process easier for project delivery.
Speaking of DJ Gribbin, the infrastructure policy director at the White House, he committed one of my personal pet peeves. He used props for displaying, sending a message, because I'm anti-prop comics. I'm not calling him a comic, but when he was talking about all the red tape, he had this whole list of, by the way,
chart.
And that only looked that big because of the font. You can fit all of that in one page, by the way. So your takeaway, you think that, the Congress, there's appetite for streamlining the regulatory process again?
Melanie makes some great points. And the prop chart, I think, also made a point, which was, look, there's all these different things going on that are really just trying to do the same kind of core things. So, for example, I'm going to blank on any examples here, but the idea is that if there's one agency does a review, the next agency doesn't have to replicate that work, and I think that you could see some support for those kinds of reforms, broad bipartisan support for that. I think that Democrats are going to be wary of saying you can roll back environmental regulations and not hurt the environment. That's just kind of counterintuitive, the other thing is Peter DeFazio, the ranking Democrat on House Transportation Infrastructure, has talked about kind of regulatory reform as kind of a gimmick to get around the idea of he really wants to see direct federal spending, and any kind of tax credits or reforms on regulation he's said is not really addressing the issue.
And then, Kathy, to those points, to be fair, the Obama administration did set up a new little agency at DOT to look at this, and this had been a priority of former Secretary Fox and Secretary LaHood.
That's true, yeah, and I mean, I think it's worth mentioning that both of the last highway bills, MAP 21 and the FAST Act, both had fairly significant streamlining, provisions in them. Of course, this is the locus of a lot of the pushback right now, and I think it's interesting if you read through Secretary Chao's testimony at EPW, like you mentioned, a lot of her testimony, she spent a lot of time. I'm talking about her prepared remarks.
Yeah.
Discussing how far they'd come in implementing those regulations, and I think so. That's the defense. That's the pre-buttal, right, against what she was, I'm sure, anticipating coming back from Democrats, which is in fact what they've been saying, which is let's make sure that we get all this stuff moving before we do more. And the other thing that I think is worth watching is these two packages of streamlining provisions in FAST Act and MAP 21 had a champion in Barbara Boxer, who was very well-known quantity to the environmental community and carried a lot of weight on her own. And I don't know, maybe there is, I don't know, but I think it's worth a question of whether there is a facsimile of her now that can achieve something like that with Democrats on the Hill.
Okay, and just to reemphasize that point, I remember Boxer could single-handedly take a very high-profile provision during conference negotiations, whether the freight industry provision, safety provision, whatever. Yeah, that's a good point. Let's stay on this topic, and I do want to talk realistically about steps forward. And we all cover Capitol Hill. There's a lot of talk in this town about stuff that are not infrastructure. Infrastructure Week, I talked to many stakeholders. They felt that the thunder was taken from them because of all the news that was happening, the White House press briefings. I talked to people on the Hill, even senior Republicans. They say that these distractions are not helpful. The Senate still has to do health care. Tax reform, is huge.
Let's not forget all the must-pass bills, FAA, spending bills, debt ceiling.
Yeah. Melanie, so this is not a prediction, but work us through the landscape on Capitol Hill, between now and the fall when Schuster wants to have some sort of a markup.
Well, it's going to be tough. It's no secret that there's a packed legislative calendar. There's a lot of other distractions, although when you talk to some of these GOP lawmakers, especially now with the appointment of a special counsel, they said it takes the heat off of them a little bit, now they can focus on their agenda. But, I think they're going to run into problems now, especially with Democrats who are going to look at those dipping approval ratings for the president. This tense atmosphere on Capitol Hill where you have Democrats calling for impeachment. Are those Democrats really going to turn around and say, let's work on this bipartisan $1 trillion infrastructure bill? So I certainly think that these things could pose a problem for the president's agenda, not just for infrastructure, but for healthcare and tax reform as well. So it's going to be an uphill climb, even for something as seemingly bipartisan as infrastructure.
And we heard Chairman Bill Schuster of the House Transportation Committee say that, I remember he was at an event earlier this year where he really acknowledged that the Republicans need a victory. They need a victory in 2018 to show voters.
He was just saying that again to Jacob and I in the hallway the other day. There's a lot of pressure on the White House here, and lawmakers are anxious to be able to take something home and point to a win, especially next year with these midterm elections coming up. I think if they do start marking up bills, that signals a step forward. But if it's not over the finish line, I think they could run into some real problems.
Well, the clock is ticking, right, Kathy? How do they?
It is.
You got debt ceiling. You have everywhere you look, the calendar's packed, and then you're not here, all of August.
I think actually, all of that, that's happening sort of in the periphery. You've got the issues with the FBI. You've got tax, the tax overhaul. You've got everything else that Congress is dealing with, the debt ceiling too. But I think even among the authorizing committees, even among Senate Commerce and House Transportation, I think they're going to have an extraordinarily busy fall, simply because I don't see them finishing a full FAA reauthorization bill by September 30th. So they're going to have to do something. And to the extent that Chairman Schuster said he wants to do this big bill, and I think that seems to me, at least at the moment, where most of his focus is going.
Mm-hmm.
The mother of all bills.
Right. So as we steam towards September 30th, you're talking about sort of what are we going to do with this infrastructure plan? It's going to have a markup. I think they're going to be consumed with whatever is happening with this FAA bill.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So even beyond the other possibly unrelated distractions, I think the authorizing committees are going to have a further very intense distraction in the form of that bill.
Right. And then Congress also in the fall has that thing where they're required to do under the Constitution, I'm borrowing humor from James Inhofe, what's wrong with me, appropriations.
Right.
And talk about the dynamics of, they've done short-term extensions on approps. We still don't have the fiscal 2018 budget, so where does approps fit into all this?
Well, I think they're behind. I think everybody would kind of acknowledge that. Steny Hoyer, the Democratic whip in the House, said on the floor this morning that I can't remember exactly what he said, but basically they are not where they need to be to pass the bills under regular order. That's nothing new. They don't usually pass bills under regular order. But it's just one more thing to add to the legislative calendar, a big thing. You know, the omnibus that came out was 1,600 pages, something like that. So if you're going to talk about funding the government for a year, even if you're going to do it in one big bill rather than 12 appropriations bills, it's a lot of work and it takes a lot of time.
Yeah, and you know that is the new world order is the regular order is gone, and I don't want to sound like an old man here, but I remember when I was a young kid, there were little tiny individual bills that would pass through the House and Senate and cleared by the president. Where do we go? What's the scenario like if they don't get tax reform done this year, or infrastructure this year? How does 2018 look?
Well, that is a great question. I mean, it feels like anything could
Do the
happen
Democrats
between
win
now
the
and then.
House?
Oh man, you're asking the wrong person. I don't know about that one, but this week alone we saw so many things happen, not related to infrastructure, that it does feel like anything could happen between now and 2018. It's really hard to predict what position the White House and the Congress is going to be in next year. I do think that the closer we do get to the elections and they don't have something done, it just becomes harder and harder. It's harder to get stuff done in an election year. I think that's why there is so much interest in trying to get all of these priorities through this year and not next year. Especially if there are things that could be a little bit politically dangerous for people to vote on. I mean, gas tax, like we said, probably not going to happen, but that, it's way harder to do in an election year. Whether or not someone would actually lose their job, I don't know, but that concern will definitely be weighing more heavily on lawmakers next year when they take those votes.
And to that point, I had a conversation this morning with the chairman of the Highways and Transit Subcommittee, Sam Graves, and I brought up the everything's on the table talking point, and he said, yes, but he's very pessimistic a gas tax, an increase of the gas tax would happen, this Congress, maybe in the future. Kathy, I'm going to let you have the last word. Hopefully this is not a big provocative question, but you brought up the FBI investigation. And I want to be as fair as possible in that President Trump campaigned on infrastructure. He borrowed from Joe Biden, talking about the third world status of airports. He said, I'm the builder in chief. He missed the 100-day fake deadline for having a plan. We have drips and sprinkles. I'm hearing that the principles thing is going to be in June, maybe July. So this timeline keeps shifting.
Right.
What happens? What's the? How do the dynamics look if the White House is unable to deliver something?
Well, I think it looks poor, and I think it kind of already looks poor, because that was among his very first campaign promises, was to do this big infrastructure bill, and he, frankly, he has all of the levers of power that he should need to have to get this done. But I will say, it's not as simple as that, because it happened to the Democrats too. The Democrats also had a moment where they had all the levers of power to get a gas tax passed, or whatever the priority should have been, would have been under a Democratic administration. Didn't happen. Trying to get that kind of thing moving in that short order is a difficult thing. It's a really big lift, and I think one thing that almost inoculates them in some ways is that I don't think anybody really expected it to happen. So I think that in that time frame, nobody really expected them to get a full bill introduced and done in 100 days. So I think that understanding actually might give them some time. And I also think, in terms of the stakeholders, I think if they get something done at some point, they'll be pretty happy with it.
Just like they were for the FAST Act.
That's right. I mean, it wasn't everything they wanted, but they were happy to get something, and I think that'll buy them a lot of goodwill. And I do think they're clearly trying. They're at least still talking about it, and I think that goes a long way too. Okay, let's leave it there. And thank you for joining us today. I thought we had a really good discussion. Obviously, there's more work to be done on the infrastructure front, and we'll continue to follow your work. I'd like to thank you, Jacob,
Jacob Fischler of CQ Rocal, Kathryn Wolfe of Politico Pro, and Melanie Zanona of the Hill newspaper. And thank you to our viewers who joined us as well. If you missed part of the show or would like to watch it again, a replay will be posted later on our website, ttnews.com, and on liveonweb.ttnews.com. Our next Live on Web program is scheduled for June 14th, when we will look at the race to automated trucking, hosted by my colleague Seth Clevenger. Until then, thank you for joining us.